Hey everybody, Mike Miller here from Triumph Visual, and this is the long-awaited How to Animate Everything in Hitfilm Part 3. If you haven't seen Parts 1 and 2, you should go back and watch those before watching this one. Part 1 covers keyframing, interpolations, and the value graph, while Part 2 covers transform controls, points, rigging, and auto-alignment features. This tutorial will assume you are already familiar with what was covered in the previous 2 parts, and no attempt will be made to explain any of those features in this tutorial. Here we are in Hitfilm Pro 2017, and the first thing we're going to take a look at today is the Slimer rig we built in the last episode. Just to step back through what's going on here, Slimer has been cut into component parts: arm, hand, body, hand and hand. And each one of the component parts has been linked to its own point. So Slimer's right arm is linked to Slimer's right arm point, Slimer's right hand is linked to his right hand point, the torso is linked to the move point, the left arm linked to the left arm point, left hand linked to the left hand point. And all I want to note is that these points are somewhat optional. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all of the existing points. So I've deleted all the arm and hand points, although I've left the bulge point and the move point intact. And what I want to do with that is just let me just open up the Slimer right arm composite, and I'm going to go ahead and open up its transform properties. So when I rotate this layer, it's rotating around the center of the layer, which is of course the center of Slimer. In the previous episode, we got around this by hooking this right arm to a point. And I'm just kind of want to note here that we technically don't need to use the points. The other way I could do this is to adjust the anchor point of the right arm. Let me turn off the torso so I can actually see that. And then copy these position keys from the anchor point, which will put it back where it originally was. This is not quite lining up correctly because I believe in the last episode I moved the arm and I moved the hand a little bit on Slimer's body to put them in a better position to animate. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag that position key a little bit more and just realign that up with the hand and turn the torso back on. So now when I rotate this arm, it's rotating around that elbow joint and not around the center of the layer. This would mean that I would have to parent the right hand to the right arm composite. So now when I drag the arm, the hand goes with it. This would mean that I would now have to go into Slimer's right hand, open up the transform controls. I'm going to have to turn the torso off to see what I'm doing. And then once again, adjust the anchor point of the hand layer, and then move the actual point back to reposition that hand, turn the torso back on, and I can now directly animate the arm and the hand will go with it, and I can directly animate the hand. I wanted to go over this quickly to show that adjusting the anchor points and transformation properties of the layer directly is a possible way to animate rather than rigging things to point rigs. But I think rigging things to the points is overall a smarter, faster, and more efficient way to work. While hooking up the hand and the arm, I don't have 2 more layers in this composite for their points. I think it was a little bit more annoying to have to adjust the anchor point of each of those layers individually. I want to go back and create a new left arm point and a new left hand point. That was faster. That was just a lot easier to do. And of course, I now have the control widget for those points. Helps if I actually connect the layers to the points. But even with that little user error there, that was still faster and easier to set up than adjusting the anchor points and transformation points of the layers directly. The next thing we're going to discuss is drawing two-dimensional animation elements directly inside Hitfilm. This is fairly easy to do. It's just a matter of stacking up colored planes and using the masking tool to draw the shapes you want. One handy Hitfilm hint you'll see here is I'm using a grade layer with a grid effect on it. One point of the grid has been set to 0, 0, the other point has been set to 100 by 100, and the entire grade layer has been set to an add blend mode. This is useful for all kinds of situations. It's just a way to set up a simple alignment grid for reference. In this case, I'm drawing a simple little bumblebee. I'm going to use a yellow plane to form the base of the body and use a circular mask to define the shape. I copied the yellow plane, made it black, and used some additional masks set to intersect mode to draw the stripes. Then, on a third black plane, I used the masking tools to quickly draw in a simple antenna, smile, and eye. Once the body was done, I made that its own composite shot and opened a second composite shot to draw a wing. To draw the wing, I just created a plane, put a light blue gradient on it, and masked out the shape. I then duplicated this plane, removed the gradient, copied the mask that made up the shape of the wing, set the copy of the mask to a subtract mode, used the transform controls to scale that down, and then slightly repositioned it. I then used a third composite shot to assemble my bumblebee body and two copies of my bumblebee wing layer. Note that with the wing layers, I've lowered the opacity of the blue gradient. I won't say this is the greatest cartoon character ever, but it's good enough for something that took me under 8 minutes to draw directly in Hitfilm for a tutorial example. And now we've got our little bumblebee body built. This guy is set up on 3 layers. The wing that would be behind the bee is on the layer behind the bee body composite, and the wing that would be in front of the bee is on the layer above the bee body composite. Those are layers 2 and 4 in this comp. Let me close that background. And I'd like to point out that layers 2 and 4, the wings, have been set to a 3D compositing mode. This is just to note that even if your animation style is basically 2D, you can still take advantage of Hitfilm's 3D compositing space. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn on keyframe animation for the B-wing foreground layer, and I'm going to turn on the X rotation. I'm going to move forward a couple of frames, and I'm going to set that to negative 180. I'm just going to copy those keyframes and paste them in. So I just keep recopying and pasting those keyframes. I'm going to come back down to the B-wing aft. Once again, turn on keyframing for the layer. And paste that in. Now I can see here that as my wing is flapping, it's wider than the composite shot that we've set up, so I'm going to go ahead and increase the composite shot to make that large enough to hold the entire bee. Oop, that's not enough. Maybe turn on motion blur for those wing layers. And I'm just going to go ahead and scale down this bee body layer. and reposition him in the center of the frame. Not the greatest animation that ever walked the earth, but I just wanted to step through this to show that it is possible to create simple cell frame animation entirely within Hitfilm by using the masking tools to draw your shapes and by using the animation tools in Hitfilm to animate. This is a very simple example. One interesting thing about it is by having the wings being 3D layers connected to this 2D layer, you can see that the perspectives, let me go to a mid-flap frame. Here we go. Even though this is more or less a two-dimensional bee, just by having those wings set up to rotate in 3 dimensions on the x-axis means as we move this guy around the screen a bit, we're seeing a little bit of parallaxing on his wings. So even though this is basically a very simple, flat, 2D graphic shape, we still have a little bit of 3D depth and parallax just because those wings are rigged to rotate in 3 dimensions on the x-axis. This is an example of an animation I was commissioned to do back in Hitfilm Ultimate 2. And everything in this animation was created entirely within Hitfilm. The bee variant shown here, the flowers, the mountains, the clouds, the sun, and the blades of grass were all drawn directly in Hitfilm with masked planes. In this case, the bees are being duplicated by a particle simulator along with all the blades of grass to make the fields. But it's not much more complicated than what was just demonstrated. Other than using the particle simulator to make lots of bees and lots of blades of grass, everything in this animation could be done inside Hitfilm Express, because it's all 2D masked planes spread out in a 3D space. I even did a version as an experiment where I used the sphere filter with masked planes to generate a fully 3D body, and then used another masked plane to draw faces and antennae and the wings, and kind of rigged those up in a way where I was able to make a almost fully 3D bee. It's not really 3D. I kind of had to fake the camera move around them in a way that's obsolete in later versions of Hitfilm, but it was a fun experiment. Next, we'll very briefly talk about setting up animation groups for 3D models in Hitfilm Pro. This is not a full tutorial on 3D models in Hitfilm Pro, that's coming later in the series. When you open a 3D model in Hitfilm Pro, on the right side of the screen you'll see a list of all of the different bits of geometry that are included within that model. You'll also see checkboxes for each of those little bits of geometry. When you click on a piece of geometry, it will highlight as red, and if you click the checkbox for that geometry, when it loads into Hitfilm, it will be brought in as a separate animation group. Animation groups in 3D models can be animated independently of the rest of the model. Also, by right-clicking on a section of geometry, you will be able to rename that. So, something like this Dalek, where everything comes in as meshes and boxes, you have the option to rename things to be more helpful, such as eye stalk discs or gun stock base. And now that our Dalek is loaded in, we can rig him up. I'm just going to right-click on the Dalek, make him a composite shot. And bring him in. Now with the model layer selected, if I go over to the layer controls and twirl open the model properties, I'll see the base model. And if we twirl open the Dalek model layer, we'll see all of these different groups that we created earlier. Each of these different groups have their own transform controls with their own anchor points, anchor point orientations, positions relative to the center of the model, their own scales, and rotation properties. This would allow me to take this portion of the Dalek, this section of eye box, and move it completely off the body. This would be useful if I were rigging this guy to explode. But what's important to notice is that each one of these subgroups in the model layer has its own parenting controls and can be parented to its own point. And this is the trick to rigging up 3D models. With Slimer, we started with his torso rig, and then we built outwards from there. With his Dalek, we want to do somewhat of the same procedure. So I'm going to create this point, name it Dalek Move Point, and parent the Dalek to the move point. Let's also adjust the master anchor point for this Dalek by opening up the world transform and adjusting the anchor point there. But first, let me toggle this to 3D for a moment, just to create a camera, and more importantly, give me that red line across the center of the screen. Now that we have the main layer for this Dalek parented to this Dalek move point, we've set up the Dalek with the point that we would use to move him across the floor or fly him through the air. And by adjusting the scale of the Dalek move point, the Dalek scales around his skirt, so if we've got him on the floor and we scale him around, we don't lose position with the floor. Now we need to create some new points. To make this a little bit easier, we'll just duplicate the Dalek move point and then offset all of these new points from it. We'll rename this new point Dalek Head Pivot. To make it easier to position these points, we've activated 3 different views in the viewer window and set one to front, one to top, and one to the right. So now when we select the Dalek head pivot point, we can just move that right up. Move that right up to the base of the dome, and shift over to the top view and center that up in the head, right between the flashers. Let's go ahead and duplicate the head pivot and rename the duplicate Eye Stalk Pivot and adjust that. I'm going to try and center that right on the pupil of the eye in the front view. And in the top view, I think that pivot point should go right in the center of this darker gray area. I think that corresponds to that bit of pivot geometry we saw when we imported him. Let's go ahead and duplicate Dalek Eye Stalk Pivot and rename that duplicate Gunstick. Make sure Gunstick is selected, and we'll kind of line that up. Finally, we'll duplicate Gunstick and rename that Arm Base. One more duplicate. Duplicate Arm Base and rename that Arm Extension. I can go back to my main camera view now, resize my layer stack. Before we get to parenting, I'm going to rearrange my points in the layer stack in a slightly more logical order. The Dalek move point is the basic point for this rig. This is the point that we use to move and scale the entire rig. So this is going to stay on the bottom. Above that, I'm going to put the arm base point and the gunstick point. The arm base and gunstick are obviously attached to the Dalek's body and should follow it around. Right above them, I'm going to put the Dalek's head pivot point, because again, the head should be dragged around with the body. Let's select those 3 layers and parent them to the Dalek's move point. The arm extension should follow the body around, but the arm extension we want to be able to let us extend the plunger arm. The arm extension can be thought of as the lower arm of the Dalek, and the arm extension should be parented to the Dalek arm base. In a similar fashion, the eye stalk pivot should be parented to the head pivot. The details on the Dalek are hard to see, so let's go ahead and open up the Dalek's material properties and turn on Casts and Receives Ambient Occlusion. Ambient Occlusion adds shading where corners and bits of geometry come together. It's something we'll talk about more when we get the full series on 3D models. For now, let's just say that makes it a lot easier to see the geometry of our Dalek, and move on. So now that we have our points set up correctly and arranged in a logical order, and we have ambient occlusion turned on so we can actually see what's happening better, let's go back into the Dalek's model layer and open up its models properties and take a look at what we have. Each of the bits of geometry we selected on import to make animation groups is isolated here in this list. And each animation group, or submodel, has its own parenting controls. Let's start with the easy one. The gunstick pivot and the gunstick are going to connect to our Dalek gunstick point. So if we zoom in, grab the Dalek gunstick point and rotate it, our Dalek can aim his gunstick, and that's it. It's just parenting the points to the geometry to build the skeleton that you want. Let's continue on and do the arm next. The arm segment and arm base pivot need to connect to the Dalek arm base. Arm segment 2 needs to parent to the Dalek arm extension. And the plunger also needs to connect to the Dalek arm extension. Once we've done that, if we open up the Dalek arm base point and rotate that around, our Dalek can now move his arm in a somewhat menacing way. Thank you, Fuzzy. More importantly, if we grab the arm extension point, we can now extend the second part of the Dalek's arm and its plunger. Our Dalek is now ready to reach out and crush your head.
What you gonna do? Sucker me to death?
Before we move up to the head, let's just take one more look at our geometry. The arm base pivot, I did not connect correctly to the arm base point. Fortunately, we'd zeroed out the orientation on the arm base point, so that is now connected correctly. And what this leaves us is everything else in here that has not been connected to a point is part of the head. We'll go ahead and select this eye box, then shift select everything down to this 3ds mesh 28. Obviously, I didn't name something correctly on import, and we'll connect those to the head pivot point. And we've just learned something here. I can't actually group select all these segments and connect them to the head point. I'm just gonna have to do that individually for each layer. Now we have everything connected to the Dalek's head pivot point, and when we rotate the Dalek's head pivot point, it should rotate correctly. And it does. We're almost done with our Dalek. The last thing we need to do is rig up the eye stalk to the eye stalk points. Well, that would be the eye stalk discs, the eye cup, and the eye stalk itself. And I think this eye pivot. And now if we look at the Dalek eye stalk pivot, we can see that that's rotating correctly. We can also see that I forgot to hook up the lens. So I'm going to reset that back to 0. That's this 3ds mesh 26. I really thought I renamed all of these on import. I guess I didn't. Okay, that needs to go to the eye stalk pivot. There we go. Now when we rotate that eye stalk, everything comes with it.
And with the Dalek rigged, it's time to do something with him. I've decided to have the Dalek roll up to the camera, look directly into the camera lens, and then shoot the camera lens. I'm not going to go over the entire animation procedure here. It's really as simple as turning on keyframing, and then changing the values on certain frames. When animating something moving through space, whether Slimer, a Dalek, a car, or a spaceship, I usually find it's best to set position for the first frame of the animation first, then set the position for the last frame of the animation, then go back and worry about the middle. Set your main or gross motions first. Get down the general movement of the object before you start worrying about the small details. In this case, it's making certain that I get the Dalek to roll up to the camera smoothly. Once that's done, I can move to smaller and smaller details. First I did the head, and for the head, I just kind of keyframed random side-to-side motions until that moment when I knew I wanted the Dalek to look at the camera. After setting those small head rotations, I went back and added the keyframes for the eye stalk. Again, just making the Dalek look up and down randomly until I wanted its attention to focus on the camera. Once I had the body motion and head motion down, it was time to move to the gun stalk and the plunger arm. Once again, it was just stepping back through the timeline, making small adjustments to the rotation values on certain frames. For the plunger arm, the only specific motion is I knew I wanted it to point up and out after the Dalek noticed the camera. For the gun stock, it has small random motions until the Dalek notices the camera, at which point the gun stock aims towards the lens of the camera. And here's the final animation with a simple background and a few other effects. The background is just a couple of planes with fractal noise applied. There are 3 lights in the scene, one red, one green, and one blue. Placing the main anchor point for the Dalek at the bottom of its skirt made it very easy to place the floor plane in this animation. Since the main move point for the Dalek was at ground level, all I had to do was parent the ground plane to the main movement point for the Dalek, set its Y position to 0 to place it at the same vertical position as the Dalek, and then rotate it 90 degrees. And it lined up perfectly. To do the lens flare at the end of the gun stick, I just created another point, placed it at the end of the gun stick, and then parented that new flare point to the gun stick pivot. A blue point light has been parented to the same point that the flare is parented to, and that light has been keyframed to increase in intensity as the Dalek's weapon charges up. After that, it's just a matter of keyframing the flare to grow in size and intensity, first as the Dalek primes its weapon, then as it fires. I could rig the Dalek's eye to glow, I could rig its flashers to glow and have the Dalek say, "Exterminate!" But those are details for another tutorial and another time. The next thing we're going to discuss is making simple skeleton rigs to help visualize how you've set things up. We're looking at a rigged version of the Dalek, and this top layer, labeled Skeleton Lightning, contains our skeleton points. The skeleton are these blue and purple lines you can see overlaying the Dalek. And if I move down to the Dalek's move point and rotate that on the Y-axis, you can see that a little bit better. As I adjust the pivot points of the Dalek rig, the lines move with it. Or if I move the sucker extend point in and out, you can see that line extending as well. Let me rotate this guy the other way and do that again. The gray layer itself contains a bunch of different lightning effects, where the ends of each lightning effect have been parented to one of the points in the rig. Let's move back over to Slimer and create a skeleton for Slimer. So I'll create a new grade point and rename this Skeleton. On the skeleton layer, I will drag in the lightning and electricity effect. To simplify the lightning, I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to take the wave scale and the twitch all the way down to 0, which gives me a straight line. I'm also going to change the blend mode from add to normal, and then I'm going to open up the branches and turn the number of branches from 5 down to 0. I'll also come down to the glow and turn the glow opacity to 0, and then move to the end width and change that to 1. I'm going to come up to the search bar and type in point. Point gives me the start and end points of my lightning. I'm going to change these values to 0, 0 for both. We can no longer see the lightning because the lightning is contained at a single point here at 0, 0. But we're going to change that in a moment. First, I want to come down and take a quick look at my rig and see what points I have. I have a basic move point, and then I have points for the right arm, right hand, left arm, and left hand. I'm going to go ahead and rename this first lightning Move to Left Arm. Close it, and then I'm going to make several duplicates. I'm going to rename this second one Move to Right Arm to right hand, left arm to left hand. I'll move back up to my search bar and type in layer. This opens up all the layer linkings for all the lightning effects. For move to left arm, I'm going to start with the Slimer move point and end at the left arm point. Go from the move point to the right arm point, from the right arm point to the right hand, and from the left arm to the left hand. Come back up to the search bar and type in color, and I can now change the colors for each of the lightnings. I'll go ahead and leave the move to shoulders white, but I'm going to change the others to blue. These simple overlays of lightning help me visualize exactly where my points are connected to each other. And again, if I come down to the arm point and start moving that, the line to the wrist point moves with it. I'm going to come back to my skeleton layer, and I'm going to go ahead and create one more copy of the lightning. And I'm going to call this one Move to Bulge. And I'm going to change the color of Move to Bulge to red. Nothing is connected to the bulge point. Nothing is moving from the bulge point. The arms and the hands are connected to their own rigs. But the bulge point is driving the bulge effect, and the bulge effect is giving Slimer's mouth some motion. You can see that here. It's the sort of thing that's easy to forget about. If I rotate Slimer's move point, we can see that the bulge point is connected to that move point, and that changes to the bulge effect, which has been placed on Slimer's torso. Move with the rest of Slimer's body. Skeleton rigs can be very useful when trying to visualize a camera rig, which will be something we'll get into more in the next episode. While I built this skeleton rig using the lightning and electricity effect, I do point out you could also use the light sword effect to do the same thing. The next thing we're going to discuss is Euler rotation and how it applies in Hitfilm. Euler rotation is named after mathematician Leonhard Euler, who was a Swiss mathematician who invented or developed many of the techniques still used today across several branches of mathematics. Euler is the only mathematician in history to actually have two constants named after him across two different branches of mathematics. For our purposes, Euler is the first mathematician to formalize how an object can be oriented in 3D space according to its rotations across three axes, x, y, and z. And the important thing to know about Euler rotations is Euler rotations happen in a fixed order. In Hitfilm, the rotation order is always x, y, and z. This means that the x rotation will be calculated first, followed by the y, and then the z. To demonstrate this, I have a 3D model of a colonial viper. And if I rotate this viper 45 degrees on the y-axis, we see what we would expect. The viper rotated 45 degrees on the y-axis, now facing out towards us. Now if I grab the orientation handle and drag it this way to try and tilt the viper up by 45 degrees, this is what we would expect to see if we input the number 45 into the rotation value. But when we enter the number 45 into the x rotation value, we end up with our viper skewed at a strange angle. And this is because the rotation is always calculated in the order of x, y, and z. Which means no matter how we set our rotation values, this x rotation, this up-down tilt, is going to be calculated first. The y rotation is calculated after the x rotation has been calculated, bringing our viper over at a skewed angle. This can require adjustment on the z-axis to correct for that skew and get our viper back where we wanted it to be, which is something roughly like this. So how do we get around the limitations of a fixed Euler rotation? Well, first let me reset these rotation values. The way to get around the limitations of the fixed Euler rotation order is simply to add more points to the rig. In the case of this viper, I'm going to duplicate the viper move point, and I'm going to rename the original viper move point Viper Y Pan, and I'm going to name the duplicate Viper X Tilt. I want the viper model to be parented to the X tilt point, and I want the X tilt point to be parented to the Y pan point. The reason I've named these Y pan and X tilt is because I'm conforming to the accepted terminology for camera operators. In camera operation, facing the camera lens up or down is tilting the camera. Turning the camera from side to side is panning the camera. So never say you're panning your camera up and down, because that's just wrong. So for me, X tilt and Y pan is just a simple description of what the motion actually is. By parenting the Viper to the X point and parenting the X point to the Y point, I have effectively changed the Euler rotation order by placing a Y point ahead of the X point. When animating the Y point, the only thing the Y point is going to animate is Y rotation. In this case, 45. By going into the Viper X tilt layer and changing its rotation to 45, we now get the angle we were trying to get initially. Yes, this means we may have 2 or more points per object to animate, but setting things up this way makes it a lot easier to control the rotation of your object and is actually easier than trying to fumble through with a single point and fixed Euler rotation orders. I'm going to reset both of those points and add a third point to the rig. The third point I've created, I have named Viper Z roll. The X tilt point is parented to the Z roll point, the Y pan point is parented to the X tilt point, and the Viper model itself is parented to the Viper Y pan point. This has effectively changed our Euler rotation order to Z, X, Y. And the reason I would do this when animating a Viper is this gives me a rotation order closer to how Vipers were shown to move in the original Battlestar Galactica. When a Viper would turn in that show, first, it would roll on the Z-axis. Then, it would rotate on the X-axis before flying away on its new vector. Vipers in the original Battlestar Galactica very rarely rotated on the Y point, and I probably don't need this, but I just left it in there to try and further illustrate how I've rigged multiple points together and animated only a single rotational axis on each point to change the Euler rotation order. If this seems complicated, don't worry about it. We're going to return to that next week when we get to cameras. In the meantime, this has been a long tutorial, part of a long 3-point series. I'd like to thank everybody for sitting through this tutorial. Come back next week when we take a look at how cameras work in Hitfilm Express and Pro. In the meantime, I'm Mike Miller for Tri-M Visual, and I'll see you next time.